And just before I turn it over to Ron to talk about a little bit about the legalities, just taking a step back because one of the questions that I often get, people are surprised to find out that there's kind of multiple different steps before the money ends up in the developer's hand. So just to take everyone on the webinar today kind of through that process, when you're typically investing in a regional center project, your funds go to an escrow account first, and that's what then is the trigger for you to be able to file your immigration application. Now, once you file the immigration application and you get your receipt notice, the funds can then be released from the escrow account and given to what we call the NCE, which is an acronym that means the new commercial enterprise. In most EB-5 offerings, although it's not required, this is typically a limited partnership, and your funds are going to be sitting in the limited partnership and ultimately made as a loan to the developer when they are ready for it. So to Mike's point, what typically happens is the developer will say, okay, March 1st, 2026, we're looking for $8 million. Here's what we're going to spend those $8 million on. Here's kind of, the invoices that we need to be paid, et cetera, et cetera. And we look at that over as a regional center. We look at that, we say, okay, this is compliant with the business plan that was approved by USCIS in the 956F filing. Fantastic, everything looks good. We'll go ahead and disperse the $8 million to the developer. And that's when the funds move from the NCE to the JCE. And so what we're talking about today is primarily about that period of time where the money is sitting in the NCE, the new commercial enterprise, waiting to be made available, waiting to be dispersed, but having already been made available to the JCE, the developer, the job creating enterprise.
So the question we're dealing with, to put it a little bit differently, is do the funds that the investor invests in the NCE need to be at the JCE for 2 years when the IE-29 is filed, or is it okay if it's at the JCE for less than 2 years? And what I'm going to conclude is, and I'll explain why, is in my opinion, under the law, there's no requirement that the money must be at the JCE for the full 2 years. Well, people may say, well, wait a minute, I know that there's a sustainment requirement, and the sustainment requirement is a 2-year requirement. In order to get the IE-29, you must prove you've sustained your investment during the 2 years of conditional residence. Well, that's true, but it doesn't answer the question of where you need to sustain your investment. And I have always taken the position, and I believe it's correct, that under the law, there's a requirement to sustain your investment in the NCE and not in the JCE, because you in fact never invest in the JCE, you only invest in the NCE. So that's the only place where you could have a sustainment requirement. So basically the sustainment requirement is pretty much irrelevant for this discussion because we're assuming that the investor's money is sustained in the NCE during the necessary 2 years. So we know that we must sustain the investment at the NCE, but we also know, well, if it just ends up there, if I invest in the NCE and the NCE just sits on the money and does nothing with it, we're not saying that's okay. It's clearly not okay. Well, why isn't it okay? The reason it's not okay is because of matter of Izumi. So there's 3 things that constitute the law in this area. There's the statute, the Immigration and Nationality Act, or the Reform and Integrity Act. There's the regulations, and there's precedent decisions. And matter of Izumi is a precedent decision, which means it's the law. And matter of Izumi says that the full amount of the money must be made available to the business most closely responsible for creating the employment, must be made available to the JCE. So if all we're doing is sustaining the investment in the NCE and the money never goes to the JCE, that would violate matter of Izumi. So we do know that the money must be made available to the JCE. But then that raises the question of what does must be made available to mean? And it must mean something different than actually sent to the JCE, all right? Because those, they're very different concepts. So what I was asked to address is a situation where the money is at risk in the NCE, subject to a draw schedule from the JCE. Whereas Ahmed explained, the JCE at various points is going to say, we need another $10 million by November 30th. And that amount would be drawn down from the amount in the NCE, rather than the NCE loaning all of the money immediately. And that's not unusual. So in that scenario, I would suggest to you, and I think it's pretty clear, that even though all of the money has not gone to the JCE yet, clearly all of the money is made available to the JCE, which is what the requirement of matter of Izumi is. So, to me, that's what the law on this subject is. It's as long as it's at the NCE, it's at risk at the NCE, there's no requirement that it be at the JCE for 2 years. The one thing that that on the next slide, I think, that we should at least mention that's out there is a draft policy memo from 2015 that could end up. So this is a policy memo that covered a lot of things, and it was issued as a draft and then never finalized. So bottom line is, not only, even if it were a policy memo, it's not the law. If it's a draft policy memo, it's not even USCIS policy, but it's out there in the world, and it's helpful to have that because it may reflect USCIS thinking. And what that says is, if at the time that they get around to adjudicating the 829, which is usually long after the 2 years of conditional residence, and if by that time the money had not been deployed to the JCE, we probably have a problem. And we'd have to look at that case by case, and there may be situations where we could argue that there's a good reason for that and it still qualifies, but certainly we would not prefer to be in a situation where years after the 829 is filed, when it's being adjudicated, the money still had not been deployed to the JCE. So that's all you're going to find in terms of USCIS policy.